Gemini, the sign of the fast mind, sharp communication, and infinite curiosity. Always remembered for intelligence, lightness, and the ability to adapt to any environment. But behind that easy smile and engaging speech, there is something almost no one notices. An invisible weight. A silent loneliness that follows Gemini from an early age. Despite appearing sociable, confident, and detached, Gemini carries a history of rejection, judgment, and misunderstanding. Gemini is not hated by accident. Gemini is hated because they see too much, and refuse to live trapped in what makes no sense. Gemini observes everything. Analyzes gestures, words, silences, and inconsistencies. They notice when something doesn't fit, and that makes people uncomfortable. While many live on autopilot, Gemini questions. While many follow labels, Gemini changes. And those who change, who think outside the box, who cannot be controlled, are often rejected. Not out of malice but out of fear. Before you judge, pause and listen. Gemini is not hated for being weak. They are hated for being too fast, too lucid, and too unpredictable for those who live stuck in a single version of reality. While many follow patterns, Gemini questions. While many repeat, Gemini observes, analyzes, and transforms. And that is exactly where the discomfort is born. From an early age, Gemini realizes they don't quite fit in. Their mind doesn't move in a straight line. It expands. They feel before others, understand before others, and speak before others. And when you see what others are not yet ready to see, you become a silent threat. Not because you want to dominate, but because you refuse to be dominated. Gemini cannot tolerate masks for long. They read the room, sense inconsistencies, and perceive hidden intentions. And when they point out truths no one asked to hear, they become labeled as difficult, unstable, or inconsistent. But the truth is simple: those who change are alive. Those who stay the same merely repeat themselves. The Gemini's loneliness does not come from rejection. It comes from clarity. Few can keep up with their mental speed. Few can sustain deep conversations without feeling exposed. Few accept someone who cannot be emotionally controlled, manipulated by guilt, or trapped by expectations. Gemini also unsettles others because they do not depend. They love, yes, but they do not erase themselves. They connect, but they do not imprison themselves. When they sense coldness, disloyalty, or constant inconsistency, they quietly pull away. No drama. No pleading. They simply close the door from the inside. And then they are called cold. They are called two-faced. They are called alone. But what truly bothers people is this: Gemini survives without validation. They reinvent themselves, adapt, and move forward. While others need to belong, Gemini understands. While others fear change, Gemini is change. If you've ever felt judged, isolated, or misunderstood, this video is not an attack. It is a mirror. And perhaps, for the first time, someone is saying out loud what you have always known deep inside. Do you want to know the 5 real reasons why Gemini is so hated, and why this often leads to loneliness? Stay until the end, because reason number 5 reveals something almost no one has the courage to admit. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your energy strengthens this space and connects us even more deeply to the true message of the signs. The hatred of the free mind. Gemini carries one of the freest minds of the zodiac, and that is exactly why it provokes so much discomfort. From an early age, Gemini shows difficulty accepting ready-made truths, rules imposed without explanation, or ideas that lack logical meaning. They question, observe, compare, and reformulate. For Gemini, thinking is a living act, constantly in motion. Nothing is too definitive to be revisited. And this mental freedom feels threatening to many. We live in a world that values labels, fixed positions, and absolute certainties. People feel safe when everything stays the same, when opinions don't change, and when thoughts follow a predictable pattern. Gemini naturally disrupts this. They change their mind not out of inconsistency but because they have learned something new. They see 2 sides, 3 paths, multiple truths coexisting at the same time. To those who need control and rigidity, this flexibility is mistaken for instability. The hatred toward Gemini's free mind is born from fear. Fear of someone who cannot be placed into a single box. Fear of someone who refuses to be defined by one role. Fear of someone who will not live trapped in a narrative just to please or belong. Gemini does not adapt to be accepted. They adapt to remain true to themselves. And this stance exposes the mental limitations of those who remain stuck in rigid structures. Gemini is often accused of being contradictory. But what few understand is that contradiction is not the same as falseness. Contradiction is growth. It is the sign of someone who allows new information to transform their worldview. While some defend opinions out of pride or fear of appearing weak, Gemini changes without guilt. They would rather evolve than remain comfortably attached to outdated ideas. This free mind also makes Gemini a quiet questioner of systems, beliefs, and relationships. They perceive inconsistencies where others normalize abuse. They notice flaws in narratives that seem perfect on the surface. And when they point this out, even lightly or with irony, they destabilize. No one enjoys having their certainties shaken. So instead of reflecting, many choose to attack. The isolation Gemini experiences is not the result of empty rebellion, but of lucidity. Not everyone is ready to coexist with someone who thinks quickly, speaks what they perceive, and changes when something no longer feels true. A free mind does not bend to please. It observes, understands, and moves forward. At its core, the hatred toward Gemini's free mind reveals more about those who hate than about the one being hated. Because mental freedom does not provoke anger, it provokes a mirror. And not everyone is ready to face what they see when Gemini dares to think for themselves. The fear of your psychological reading. Gemini possesses a psychological ability that few signs can sustain, the capacity to read people in real time. This is not guesswork, but deep observation. Gemini notices micro-expressions, shifts in tone, pauses in speech, and inconsistencies between words and actions. They hear what is said, and, above all, what is avoided. This silent reading happens naturally, almost automatically, and that is precisely what creates discomfort. The fear many feel around Gemini comes from the sensation of being too transparent. Near them, masks weaken. Rehearsed narratives lose strength. People who build identities based on appearance, status, or emotional control feel exposed. Gemini doesn't need to confront to reveal. Their mere presence already disrupts those who live sustaining characters. Unlike signs that absorb emotions passively, Gemini analyzes. They cross-reference information, test patterns, and observe reactions over time. For this reason, they rarely jump to conclusions. When Gemini perceives something, it has already passed through a complex mental process. And when they finally step away, it is not impulsive, but the result of a clear understanding that there is incoherence, manipulation, or emotional games at play. This psychological power is often distorted. Gemini is labeled cold, calculating, or distant. But in truth, they simply refuse to engage where they sense imbalance. Their psychological reading functions as a mechanism of self-protection. They understand that not every smile is sincere, and not every sweet word is true. And this emotional clarity unsettles those who prefer relationships built on illusion. Another factor that generates fear is that Gemini rarely verbalizes everything they perceive. They observe in silence. They store information. They analyze behavior over time. This creates an invisible tension. People feel they are being understood more deeply than they would like. And when someone realizes they cannot deceive, manipulate, or confuse, the natural reaction is not admiration, it is defense. That is why many attack Gemini before being confronted. They project intentions that do not exist. They create narratives to discredit Gemini's perception. It is easier to label than to admit that someone has seen uncomfortable truths. Gemini's psychological reading is not used for control, but for discernment. They do not invade, pressure, or demand confessions. They simply observe and decide. And this emotional autonomy is frightening. Because living close to someone who sees beyond appearances requires honesty. And not everyone is prepared for that. In the end, the fear of Gemini's psychological reading does not come from malice, but from clarity. Gemini does not create truths, they perceive them. And those who fear being truly seen will inevitably try to push away those who have the eyes to see. The refusal to be emotionally controlled. Gemini values emotional freedom just as much as mental freedom. For Gemini, Loving does not mean losing one's identity or submitting to psychological games disguised as care. They connect, open up, talk, and share ideas and feelings, but the moment they sense attempts at emotional control, something closes off inside. Not out of coldness, but out of an instinct for self-preservation. Emotional control rarely appears openly. It shows up through subtle demands, guilt disguised as concern, punitive silences, unspoken expectations, and quiet emotional blackmail. Gemini notices this quickly. Their psychological awareness detects when affection begins to be used as a tool of power. And that is exactly when they pull back. Many interpret this withdrawal as detachment, immaturity, or an inability to go deep. But the truth is the opposite. Gemini feels intensely, they simply refuse to remain where love requires self-erasure. They understand that healthy bonds do not imprison, suffocate, or condition affection on emotional obedience. When they realize they are being pressured to act, feel, or react in a certain way just to keep the peace, they step away. This refusal of emotional control is unsettling because it breaks familiar dynamics. People accustomed to exerting influence through guilt or dependency feel powerless around Gemini. They do not respond with emotional outbursts or dramatic confrontations. Their response is conscious silence and gradual distance. Not to punish, but to protect their emotional integrity. Gemini also refuses relationships where the other person tries to define who they should be emotionally. They do not tolerate labels like cold, distant, or difficult being used to force them to change their nature. They understand that everyone loves differently, and they will not be molded to fit someone else's expectations. This emotional autonomy can lead to loneliness, but it also creates self-respect. Gemini would rather be alone than trapped in relationships that demand constant vigilance, excessive explanations, or continuous proof of affection. They know that true love does not control, measure, or imprison. It flows. At the core, what disturbs people most is that Gemini cannot be emotionally dominated. They observe, understand, and choose. And when they choose to leave, it is not due to a lack of feeling, it is due to an excessive awareness. Because those who know their worth do not accept being held by fear, guilt, or emotional dependence. The ease of reinvention. Gemini possesses a rare ability to reinvent themselves without losing their essence. While many signs cling to the past, to outdated identities, or to versions of themselves that no longer work, Gemini understands that life is movement. For them, change is not a betrayal of who they were, it is an honor to who they are becoming. And this ease of reinvention inspires admiration, but also a great deal of resistance. Much of the hatred directed at Gemini comes from a misunderstanding of this ability. People project onto them their own difficulty with change. Where there is courage, they see superficiality. Where there is adaptation, they see instability. But Gemini does not change out of emptiness. They change because they learn quickly, recognize when something no longer makes sense, and have the courage to move forward. Gemini's reinvention happens on many levels. They change interests, paths, environments, and even relationships when they sense stagnation. Not from a lack of feeling, but from an excess of lucidity. They understand that insisting on what no longer grows is a silent way of dying inside. That is why they prefer the discomfort of the new over the prison of the familiar. This ability to begin again deeply unsettles those who are trapped in their own history. For many, the past defines identity. For Gemini, the past is simply a stage. They do not carry guilt for old versions of themselves. They learn, integrate, and move on. This creates the false impression of emotional detachment, when in reality it is adaptive maturity. The ease of reinvention also makes Gemini resilient. They fall, observe, understand the mistake, and reorganize quickly. They do not victimize themselves for long periods. They do not cling to the role of the wounded. This quiet strength provokes envy in those who are still trying to recover from old falls. And often that envy turns into judgment. In relationships, Gemini's reinvention is seen as a threat. People who need predictability feel insecure around someone who is constantly evolving. But Gemini does not change to abandon, they change to stay alive. They only step away when they realize the other demands they remain the same in order to maintain the relationship. Ultimately, Gemini's ease of reinvention reveals their emotional intelligence. They understand that life is not static, that people change, and that resisting transformation creates suffering. The problem is not with those who change, but with those who demand permanence where truth no longer exists. Gemini is not unstable. They are adaptable. And that adaptability is what keeps them moving, even when the world insists on standing still. The loneliness of those who see ahead. Gemini's loneliness does not come from a lack of people around them, but from the different mental timing in which they live. Gemini tends to see ahead. Ahead of changes, ahead of breakups, ahead of truths becoming obvious. Their fast mind connects patterns, anticipates consequences, and notices subtle signs that go unnoticed by most. And living a few steps ahead comes at a cost. Not everyone can keep up. Gemini realizes when a relationship has already lost its meaning long before the other person admits it. They see inconsistencies, emotional wear, and silences disguised as normalcy. While many continue out of attachment, fear, or habit, Gemini has already understood the ending. This anticipation makes them seem cold or detached, when in reality they are simply accepting what has already become clear in their mind. This lucidity creates isolation. Superficial conversations exhaust them. Emotional repetition becomes draining. Gemini seeks intellectual stimulation, real exchange, and conscious presence. When they don't find it, they prefer silence over empty company. Not because they feel superior, but because they deeply sense the emptiness of connections that do not evolve. Being surrounded by people and still feeling misunderstood is one of the most silent pains they carry. Loneliness also arises because Gemini sees truths others are not ready to hear. They perceive toxic dynamics, self-destructive patterns, and comfortable illusions. When they speak, even gently, they create discomfort. And when they stay silent, they withdraw. In both cases, they end up isolated. Because seeing ahead means choosing between being misunderstood or stepping away. Another factor is that Gemini rarely finds someone who can match both their mental and emotional speed at the same time. Many can reach one but not the other. This creates quiet frustration. They learn to be self-sufficient, to dialogue with themselves, to seek stimulation in ideas, studies, projects, and in observing the world. Loneliness becomes a space for growth, but also for longing for a rare connection. This loneliness is not weakness. It is the result of awareness. Those who see ahead learn to walk alone for long stretches. They learn not to depend on external validation to confirm what they already know inside. But this does not mean Gemini doesn't want companionship. It simply means they refuse just any company. In the end, Gemini's loneliness is the price of seeing beyond the obvious. It is the burden of those who perceive earlier, and must wait for the world to catch up with what their mind understood long ago. Gemini is not hated because they are empty. They are hated because they are too deep for those who live on the surface. Their loneliness is not failure, it is the consequence of lucidity, freedom, and inner truth. And you? Have you ever felt judged or misunderstood for being a Gemini? Share your experiences in the comments. Sometimes your story is exactly what another Gemini needs to hear. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss future content, and share this with other Geminis. Your energy strengthens this community.